Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Maxime, and I'm thrilled to be your host tonight to welcome you to this festival. It's the sixth edition of the International Film Festival. And the topic, as you know, is resistance. It's an exciting topic, resistance in the great works of international cinema. And tonight we are thrilled and spoiled because we're going to watch one of the best movies ever. It's regularly ranked as in the top 50 of the best movies ever made. And so I'm thrilled to have with us Edwige Tamalet Talbayev. And before I let you present the movie, I wanted to say a few thanks. I want to thank you in the audience for taking time to be with us. We know you have many options and you're very busy, so thank you for joining us tonight. You are in for a treat. I want to thank the generous support of the WLL Department, World Languages and Literature. I want to thank the French Club for its support, SMU libraries as well, residence life and student housing. I want to thank also a few people. I want to start with Renata Egues, who is the director of the festival. And she is very enthusiastic, very supportive, and just, I mean, it's amazing to work with you. Thank you, Renata, for directing this festival. I want to thank Rob Walker for being so efficient behind the scenes, making sure that everything works well. Rob, we are very, very glad to rely on you and very grateful. And I want to mention that we are lucky to have two professors who include currently this semester who include Algeria. Hervé Chumkan, Professor Chumkan is currently teaching a class on l'Archi. So this is a great topic. And he's been teaching this class for a few years now. It's a successful class. And my other colleague, Antoinette Williams-Stutt, is teaching a class on Francophone women authors. And in her class this semester, she has included Algeria is Beautiful Like America, which is a bande dessinée, a comic by Olivia Burton and Maddie Grant. So Algeria is definitely taught at SMU. And now I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Edwige. Thank you so much for taking time to join us tonight. You come from not so far away because you are in New Orleans, so next door, basically in Louisiana, and you are Associate Professor of French in the Department of French and Italian at Tulane University. You are the director of the grad studies and the MENA studies. So MENA, it's Middle East and North Africa. And you are the author of the Transcontinental Maghreb, Francophone Literature Across the Mediterranean, which was published in 2017. You also are the co-editor of Critically Mediterranean, Temporalities, Aesthetics, and Deployments of a Sea in Crisis. That was published a year later in 2018. And last but not least, you are the editor of the very prestigious journal Expression Maghrébine. We are so lucky to have you with us tonight. Would you like maybe, you will take the questions after the movie. So guys, if you have questions when you watch this movie, you can actually include them in the Q&R link, which is on your Zoom. And if you want to watch the movie on Vimeo, you also have the link in the discussion with the password. Although the movie is going to be screened for everybody on this link, but in case it doesn't work, you have another option on Vimeo. Voila, Edwige, would you like to introduce this masterpiece?
I will, yes, I would like to introduce it. Thank you so much. First of all, a few words of thanks on my end for the wonderful invitation to be with you tonight. To Hervé Chumkan, who was the one really who came up with the idea of bringing me over to SMU virtually tonight. I'm delighted to be with you. And also a word of thanks and gratitude to our moderator, Professor Foerster, and to Professor Egues as well for the logistical help planning the visit, as well as Rob Walker, of course, for all the technical support. So I'm very excited to be here. I think it's wonderful that you're having a festival that centers on resistance in movie and film, especially in relation to the global South, what in those days was thought about as the third world. And you will see, I hope from my introduction, that this is really a film that that almost single-handedly put third world resistance cinema on the map. And it's a true treat, and I'm very excited to be introducing it for you tonight. I will share my screen now. I have a few slides of PowerPoint that I want to show you. I'll be presenting as I show the slides, and then we'll move on to the film. Let's see, this should be working. Yes, okay. Can you see it? Yes?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Can you see the next slide?
No.
No. All right. Let me try again then. Let's try this other. All right.
Perfect.
Yes, there you go. All right, so this is the poster for the movie, and you have a few things here. So I'll start with this image here. So the Battle of Algiers has been called a docudrama. It came out in 1966, and it was broadly described as the first great Algerian production. That means post-independence Algerian production, since Algerian independence came in 1962. The film is very much a transnational, international collaboration that was directed by Italian filmmaker Gillo Pontecorvo, who was a Marxist and a member of the Italian Communist Party, as well as a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, where he fought on the side of Republicans against the Franquist fascists. At the time he started working on the Battle of Algiers, he had already made one film that was known to critical acclaim, Capo, which takes place in an Italian concentration camp in World War II. He went on to make several subsequent anti-imperialist films about the disparity of power between First and Third World after the Battle of Algiers, most notably Queimada, Burn in 1969, with Marlon Brando as the lead actor, which depicts an attempted slave revolt in the Caribbean that is undercut by the character that Brando plays, who is a secret government agent working to serve the interests of a fictional sugar company. So the Battle of Algiers was released in 1966 as an Algerian-Italian production through the recently created Algerian Casbah Film production. The film narrates the nationalist-led insurrection known as the Battle of Algiers, which was a war of reprisal, a sort of guerrilla, between the French colonial troops, most notably paratroopers, and that's what you will be seeing in the movie on the one hand, and on the other hand, the insurgent forces of the Algerian Nationalist Party, called the FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, or National Liberation Front, that extended across the Algerian capital through 1956 through 1957. As the violence escalated, Jacques Massu, who was the head of the 10th Paratrooper Division, was summoned to Algiers in January 57 and given full authority to restore order in the city. Facing him for the FLN was Youssef Saadi, the actor, an actor who actually appears, so he's a historical figure, but he appears as an actor in the film. He plays the character of Jafar toward the end of the film. You'll see him. So Youssef Saadi and his 1,400 FLN men who were rigorously organized and trained. So the Battle of Algiers, which took place in 57, was in many ways a turning point in what was to be known as the Algerian War of Independence, which started in 1954 and ended in 1962 after 8 years with the proclamation of an independent Algeria. So I'd like to give you a few pointers now about what the situation in Algeria was at the point, because you'll see that the film really engages the details of the war and the military operations, and you need a little bit of background to understand what's happening. So on the French side, of course, it is a story of colonialism. After the 1830 brutal conquest of Algeria, followed by 18 years of so-called pacification, Algeria became one of the main French colonies in Africa through a process known as départementalisation, which means the subdivision of the territory into 3 départements, which are administrative units that were then attached to the metropolitan territory. An influx of French nationals, but also other Europeans rushed to the country, encouraged in part by the French colonial government, who was gifting land to Europeans in an effort to entrench colonial domination and European supremacy in a land that was mostly native, obviously, mostly Algerian. Through these measures, Algeria became what was to be known as the colonie de peuplement, that is a settler colony where generations of French families had settled and lived. By the time the war started on November 1st, 1954, there were 1 million French nationals, either by birth or naturalized in Algeria, who were endowed with the many privileges of citizenship. And on the other hand, 9 million natives who were known as musulmans, Muslims, who had suffered the brunt of land confiscation, and then a process that Germaine Tillion, an ethnographer, French ethnographer who worked on Algeria, is called clochardisation, which means a kind of organized destitution through confiscations of land and other measures meant to undermine the native community. So that was the French side. On the Algerian side, nationalism, of course, took root very early in the 1920s, in fact, in immigrant communities in Paris. But at the time of the film, the action of the film, the Battle of Algiers, the main nationalist party, the one that is featured in the film, is the FLN, the National Liberation Front. Even in the 50s, it wasn't the only nationalist party, but through the eradication of other nationalist movements that have predated it, it became the sole nationalist actor during the independence process. So interestingly, and that's why I was telling you this story, the production of this film itself is very much involved with what's happening in terms of politics after 1962, especially with the FLN, who was a participant in the making of the film, who was one of the main sources of funding for the film, and also a participant in the negotiations with the screenplay writer, Franco Salinas, as to what form the film was going to take. So there's an interesting anecdote actually about plot lines for the film that I wanted to tell you. So originally Salinas had envisioned a very different plot to what you're going to see tonight. It was a plot that centered on a paratrooper figure who was supposed to be played by Paul Newman, who was going to be this romantic figure going through some kind of inner turmoil, and that was going to be the emphasis of the film. But then the FLN that was bankrolling the project rejected it because it was thought to be too romantic and insufficiently political. So that was shelved. And then the FLN instead countered by offering another plot that was penned by the very Youssef Saadi, historical leader of the insurrection, who himself had written memoirs of the Battle of Algiers that came out in '62 in France, and who penned this kind of propagandist plot that was really a nod to the glory of FLN. And of course, the plot didn't go very far because Pontecorvo nipped it in the bud and refused to make the film with that particular plot. So what you're seeing tonight actually is the result of those protracted negotiations between the two ends of the spectrum here, which proposes a blend of creative energies between, on the one hand, Algerian nationalism through the FLN, and then European cinematic sensibility through Pontecorvo's work, which here follows an aesthetic that is very specific to Europe at the time, and which has a lot to do with Italian neorealism, a movement incarnated by filmmakers such as Luchino Visconti, for instance, or Roberto Rossellini, who made Roma Città Aperta, which I understand you've been watching in this film festival, so you'll know all about it and all about what I'm talking about. This realist aesthetics, which spotlights stories about the working class that are interpreted by non-professional actors. So the style of the film, The Battle of Algiers, is very noteworthy, and you will see it during the screening. It has a sort of newsreel-like immediate quality. The camera has a TV lens, which gives a very specific aesthetic, very grainy aesthetic, for instance. The black and white aesthetics is also reminiscent of newsreel. So all of this partakes of a unique aesthetic called cinéma vérité, or truthful cinema, which was characterized by handheld cameras, crowds of non-professional actors, and unbalanced compositions, which all were meant to capture the reality of the event and to minimize the distance between the viewer and then the event that was depicted. The film itself was shot on location in the Algiers Casbah, and you can actually see some of those landmarks when you visit the Casbah today. That happened to me in 2014 when I went there. I had the great fortune of seeing some of those landmarks in person. That was a really wonderful experience. So the film is inspired by true events, but it still is fictionalized, which raises the issue of the ethics of representing a fictionalized version of real life events in a style that aims to pass for authentic. Because the film's central claim to realism, what Pontecorvo himself has called the dictatorship of truth, and it has become one of those key phrases about the film, the dictatorship of truth, that this film was absolutely realistic. But really, if you look into it and you start comparing it to the reality, you see there are a number of inaccuracies and a number of things that are occluded, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. And so it tends to poke holes a little bit into the cinéma vérité theory. So this is very much a film about le peuple, the people, this mythical category that underpinned the myth of a popular anti-colonial revolt in Algeria, and that by the same token was meant to legitimize the power of the FLN, which was already in '65 when the film was being shot, that was turning slowly toward authoritarianism. By the way, FLN is still the party in power in Algeria today. So what we see in the film is very much relevant to the situation in Algeria today. 65, for instance, is the date of a military coup, the Boumediene coup. So we can see that whatever we see, this kind of popular revolt in 62 is going to become very different 3 years after independence all the way to today. So what's very interesting is that there's no clear hero in the film. And what the hero is supposed to be is really the peuple, the people. There was only one actor, in fact, who was a professional. Can you see the next slide again?
Nope.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know why it's not changing. Let me change slides here and then, and then share my screen again. Okay. This is the actor. This is Jean Martin, who's the only actor that was a professional actor in the film.
Okay.
And so the hero, Jean Martin is Colonel Mathieu, and he's far from being a hero, as you will see, because of course he's on the side of the French, and he is responsible for some very incredible acts of torture, especially, which we'll talk about. So in terms of the reception, the film was very well received. It won a Lion d'Or at the Venice Film Festival in '66, as well as other prizes in '66, was nominated for many Academy Awards in '67, '69, was played in film festivals. It was very well received abroad, but in France, the film was actually banned until 1971, really, and then it was showed in a sort of expunged version in movie theaters, despite threats and bombings and all kinds of very severe reaction. In the early days of the film, it became required viewing for anti-colonial and revolutionary movements the world over. So the 60s are obviously the decade of decolonization, which started earlier, especially in North Africa. Both Tunisia and Morocco, which are immediately adjacent to Algeria, were independent in 1956, just pretty much at the time of the events that we're talking about here in the film. But it was also the decade of third worldism in the wake of the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference in '55, where the newly decolonized African and Asian countries had met to discuss self-determination and, more importantly, the non-aligned movement. So this movement where third world countries had decided not to align in the Cold War context with either the first world, that is Europe and the United States, or what was in those days called the second world, that is the Soviet Union. In the 60s, the film's audience were often young people who shared the director's sympathies for the guerrillas of the FLN, and they were usually partial to decolonization and third worldism. So of course, they would favor the other character in the film here that you see, Ali Lapointe, okay, incarnated by Brahim Hajjaj, the streetwise freedom fighter who had organized a network of terrorist cells within the Casbah city in Algiers. The film knew a very interesting revival in the early 2000s, with the Criterion DVD being reissued with additional materials, as well as many festivals screening the film in France and the US, including the Pentagon. And actually, I have a couple of slides about this because that's a very uncanny, an uncanny intersection. Here's an excerpt here that you can see from the New York Times article that came out around the same time. And I wondered why on earth the Pentagon would be interested in seeing a film about Algerian insurrections in the 1950s in French colonial Algeria. The Pentagon showing drew a more professionally detached audience of about 40 officers and civilian experts who were urged to consider and discuss the implicit issues at the core of the film, the problematic but alluring efficacy of brutal and repressive means in fighting clandestine terrorists in places like Algeria and Iraq, or more specifically, the advantages and cost of resorting to torture and intimidation in seeking vital human intelligence about enemy plans. An officer with the Directorate for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict added to this that showing the film offered historical insight into the conduct of French operation in Algeria and was intended to prompt a formative discussion of the challenges faced by the French. In his account, the discussion was lively and plans for additional screenings were made. So what's so unique then about this film that it was still considered relevant to the US military 40 years later? Well, first of all, it stages a people's war, the ability of ordinary people to take up arms against a common enemy under the guise of their everyday identity. So this emphasizes the unpredictable element of this kind of warfare. And we can see the parallels here, obviously, with what the US was experiencing in Iraq during the war on terror. Of course, the film's direct handling of the question of torture, which we will be seeing in a minute, was as relevant to French Algeria in the 50s as it was to the US war on Iraq in 2003. The allure of the film also doubles as a moral question, as it exposes the difficulty of winning the war, not just in terms of operations, but really also in terms of winning the war on moral grounds, the war on public opinion. What fascinated the Pentagon, in fact, was that this film was precisely what was showing how the French had technically won the Battle of Algiers. You will see at the end that all of the leaders are arrested, that the French regain control over the Kasbah, and that that particular branch of the FLN is headed off. And yet some critics and historians have argued that the Battle of Algiers is precisely where the war shifted and where the French, despite winning the battle, started losing the war because of all the scandals that followed, the use of torture and the forcible disappearances and the murders that followed, and that brought the Fourth Republic to an end, as we know, that required a Fifth Republic, the return of General de Gaulle to power, and that in many ways fractured the country in two. So this renewed interest in the film in the 2000s is not random, because in fact, there has been increased scrutiny in France of this period of colonial atrocities in metropolitan France ever since that time. It started with an article published in Le Monde in 2001 by an Algerian nationalist, Louise Irilarriz, who was arrested by paratroopers, raped and tortured during the Battle of Algiers. So this particular article unleashed a torrent of testimonies. And in 2001, one of the main artisans of torture in Algeria, Paul Osares, a general, published a book of memoirs, Services Spéciaux, where he justified his use of torture in Algeria as necessary. Interestingly, he was later convicted, in fact, for complicity in justification of war crimes because of this book. He revealed also that the torture had been ordered by the highest level of French governmental hierarchy. So that was very shocking, obviously, to the country. And Massieu himself, the head of the paratroopers, who is here depicted by this character, Colonel Mathieu, is a rendition is a mix of Bijard and Massieu, but it really draws on Massieu more. Massieu himself published his memoir, La vraie bataille d'Alger, which attempted to naturalize and justify the use of torture as a means to save French lives by preventing further terrorist attacks. Torture, in his word, was a necessary evil, a mal nécessaire, adding that it was only commensurate to the use of extreme violence employed by the FLN, very much in an eye for an eye logic. So around that time, another film came out that also undermined these accounts of the necessity of torture, which was a 3-part documentary by Patrick Rothman, L'ennemi intime, which was replete with testimonial from all levels of veterans. And it was a very emotional film and very powerful film because it staged 60-year-old men in tears at the thought of past crimes. And its release shocked France and forced this late reckoning with the Osares and Massieu narrative of the necessity of torture, which was still pretty much the dominant idea at the time in France. Many veterans actually argued that the same results could have been achieved without it. So in this sense, and I will end with this, if we were to reassess the Battle of Algiers today and what it has been doing in terms of understanding this historical period, one could conclude that it was a precursor to all of these late documentaries and testimonials that that were published in the 2000s and since in France. Though it does tend to whitewash the kinds of pressure and violence that the nationalist movement FLN itself was exerting on the Algerian population, for instance, reprisals against civilians who refused to assist the movement, purges against its own dissenting members, or executions of members of rival nationalist factions, the Battle of Algiers ultimately tells a difficult and at the time concealed story in a very critical voice. And that's the story of atrocities that punctuated France's colonial past. In this respect, it plays against the efforts to sanitize the memory of colonialism and the supposed positive role of colonization, which have been, which were underfoot in France around the year 2005, and this proposed bill to introduce the positive role of colonization to French curricula in public schools. So that is why it remains to this day a crucial snapshot of a hotly debated period, casting light both on the repressed memories of a deliquescent colonial order, since it is at that point that France and the French colonial empire renounced any claim to moral leadership during this key moment, in fact, of the Battle of Algiers, since it is when it adopted torture as a naturalized practice. And also it remains and endures as a testimony on the rise of a powerful nationalist movement, which will become an iconic model for all the colonial and revolutionary movements in the world, in part thanks to the fame of this film, The Battle of Algiers. So I will stop here now, and we can move on to the film, and I'll be happy to answer any question that you might have. Please feel free to type them up in the chat function as the film unfolds, or to ask them orally at the end of the screening. Thank you very much.